Here's a compelling hook to begin your speech on the history of the India and Pakistan War of 1965 in a thoughtful, emotional tone. Have you ever wondered how a line drawn on a map could lead to a war that shaped the lives of millions? Sometimes, the loudest echoes of history come not from the battlefield, but from the silence that follows when neighbors become strangers and peace becomes a memory. Today, we revisit one such momentous war, not just of guns and tanks, but of hopes, fears, and the unfinished story of two nations born from the same land. You know. Sometimes in life, we find ourselves in the middle of something very big, something that changes the way people feel about each other, sometimes for a very long time. Today, I want to share a story from our past. It's not a story with a happy ending, but it is a story we can learn from. In 1965, two neighbors India and Pakistan found themselves in a storm. This storm didn't come from the sky, but from history, hurt, and deep disagreements, especially about a place called Kashmir. For years, there were arguments about who this beautiful region belonged to, and in those arguments, trust started to disappear. One day, a plan was made. A plan by Pakistan called Operation Gibraltar, hoping people in Kashmir would rise up and help them. But that didn't happen. People were confused and scared, and when India saw what was happening, it responded by sending its soldiers across the border. That's when the fighting truly began, September 6, 1965. The fighting was fierce. Big tanks rolled through fields. Soldiers fought bravely on both sides, each believing they were doing the right thing. There were battles near Asal and Lahore. People who had farms and homes suddenly found themselves near war zones. Their lives changed forever. After 17 hard days, the world stepped in. A ceasefire was called. Leaders from both sides met in a place called Tashkent to find peace again. They agreed to stop fighting and to go back to how things were before the war started. Even though no one really won, something important happened. The world saw just how high the cost of war could be, and the people on both sides carried the weight of it in their hearts. You see, war doesn't just happen in faraway places, it happens in the hearts of people when we stop listening, when we stop caring, and when we stop seeing each other as human. That's why stories like these matter, not just to remember the past, but to remind us that peace, though difficult, is always worth trying for. So whenever you hear about borders, or arguments, or conflict, I hope you'll also think about bridges, because even in the darkest parts of history, there is always a chance to learn, to grow, and to choose kindness again. After gaining independence from British colonial rule in 1947, India and Pakistan were born as two separate nations, but their division was accompanied by deep communal violence and an unresolved territorial dispute over the princely state of Jammu and Kashmir. This region, with a Muslim-majority population but a Hindu ruler, became the flashpoint for conflict almost immediately. The Maharaja of Kashmir chose to accede to India during the partition crisis, which led to the First Indo-Pakistani War in 1947–48. Although that war ended with a unmediated ceasefire and a line of control dividing the territory, the issue remained. Far from resolved, Pakistan viewed Kashmir as a natural part of its territory due to its Muslim population, while India insisted on its legal accession. Over the years, this unresolved conflict brewed anger, suspicion, and political tensions. Between the two neighbors, both nations began building up their military capabilities, and small skirmishes along the border and in Kashmir became increasingly common. The political leadership in both countries used the Kashmir issue to rally nationalist support, and public sentiment became more hostile. Diplomatic efforts were made, but none could resolve the deep mistrust that had taken root. By the early 1960s, Pakistan's leadership believed that India, weakened by the recent war with China in 1962 and domestic instability, would not be able to strongly respond to an armed campaign in Kashmir. This belief became the foundation for planning a future operation. Meanwhile, India continued to assert its administrative control over Jammu and Kashmir, investing in infrastructure and deploying more troops. Both sides monitored each other closely, and the situation remained fragile. Decades of grievances, the emotional pull of Kashmir, and a growing military confidence laid the groundwork for the larger conflict that would erupt in 1965. In 1965, Pakistan launched a covert military operation known as Operation Gibraltar, aiming to infiltrate Jammu and Kashmir and incite an uprising among the local Muslim population against Indian rule. The plan was based on the assumption that widespread dissatisfaction existed in Kashmir, and that the people would welcome Pakistani forces as liberators. Thousands of Pakistani soldiers, dressed in civilian clothing and armed with weapons and explosives, crossed the line of control and entered Indian-administered Kashmir. Their mission was to create chaos, disrupt communication lines, and encourage a rebellion that would weaken Indian control and justify broader Pakistani military intervention. However, the plan did not go as expected. The local population did not rise in revolt. Instead, many informed Indian authorities of the infiltrators' presence. The Indian army quickly mobilized to counter the infiltration, and intense clashes erupted across the region. Pakistan's hope that the operation would remain secret and trigger a local uprising was dashed within days. Indian forces began to capture or kill infiltrators, and the situation rapidly escalated. Operation Gibraltar was planned without sufficient coordination or understanding of the ground realities in Kashmir. Many of the infiltrators were unfamiliar with the terrain and local languages, making it difficult for them to blend in. Their presence was quickly detected, and Indian forces were able to act decisively. As Indian forces regained control and pushed back the infiltrators, the operation's failure became evident. The plan that was intended to be a quick and decisive blow instead turned into a provocation for a much larger conflict. In response to the infiltration and subsequent attacks, India decided to open a new front by crossing the international border into Pakistan's Punjab region. What began as a covert operation soon escalated into a full-scale war between the two countries. On the morning of September 6, 1965, India officially crossed the international border into Pakistan, marking the beginning of a full-scale war. This was a direct response to Pakistan's Operation Gibraltar and the continued infiltration in Jammu and Kashmir. Indian military leadership, recognizing the need to shift the battleground away from the difficult terrain of Kashmir, decided to strike in the Punjab region of Pakistan. The Indian Army launched a major offensive towards Lahore, a strategically significant city just a few kilometers from the border. The attack came as a surprise to Pakistan, which had anticipated that the conflict would remain confined to Kashmir. Indian forces advanced rapidly, capturing several important positions near Lahore and threatening to cut off key supply lines. Simultaneously, Indian troops moved towards Sialkot and other areas along the Western Front. The aim was to apply pressure on multiple fronts and stretch Pakistan's defense resources. Pakistan responded with force, mobilizing its army and launching. The early Indian advances, however, put Pakistan on the defensive in several sectors. Major battles began to unfold in the plains of Punjab, where both sides deployed large numbers of tanks, artillery, and infantry units. India's decision to cross the international border marked a significant escalation of the conflict, transforming it from a limited regional skirmish into a full-fledged war. The move was also symbolic, as it demonstrated India's willingness to take the battle beyond Kashmir and directly challenge Pakistani military positions. The fighting quickly intensified, drawing international attention and concern. Airstrikes were launched by both sides, and cities close to the border, including Amritsar and Lahore, experienced bombings. Despite the fierce combat and destruction, the war remained relatively short. But the decision to cross the international border was a turning point that defined the nature and scale of the 1965 conflict. As the conflict escalated, several major battles unfolded, particularly in the Punjab region, which became the primary theatre of war. One of the most significant confrontations was the Battle of Asal, Uttar, fought near the town of Kemkoran in Indian Punjab. In this battle, the Indian army strategically used the terrain to its advantage by flooding the sugarcane fields, which bogged down the advancing Pakistani tanks. Pakistani forces, equipped with American-supplied Patton tanks, suffered heavy losses as Indian anti-tank units ambushed them. Over 90 Pakistani tanks were destroyed or captured, making it one of the largest tank battles fought after World War II and a decisive moment for Indian defense efforts. Simultaneously, intense fighting erupted in the Siakat sector. The Battle of Choinder, located near Siakat in Pakistan, witnessed a massive armored clash between both countries. It became one of the largest tank battles in South Asia. Indian forces pushed deep into Pakistani territory, and fierce resistance from Pakistani troops halted further advances. Both armies suffered heavy casualties, and the area witnessed days of continuous shelling, tank combat, and airstrikes. Meanwhile, in the Kashmir Valley, Indian and Pakistani troops clashed along high-altitude posts, with each side trying to control strategic ridges and passes. The harsh mountainous terrain and difficult weather conditions made the fighting extremely challenging. In the air, both nations carried out bombing missions targeting military installations, supply depots, and airfields. Pakistani jets attacked Indian airbases, while the Indian Air Force responded with strikes on Lahore and other key cities. Despite the intense military engagement, no major city was captured by either side. Though some villages and posts changed hands temporarily, the battles demonstrated the high level of preparedness, bravery, and sacrifice from soldiers on both sides, and highlighted the devastating power of modern warfare in the subcontinent. As the fighting dragged on, and casualties mounted on both sides, the international community grew increasingly concerned about the growing scale of the conflict between India and Pakistan. The United Nations intervened, urging both countries to agree to an immediate ceasefire. With pressure mounting from major world powers like the United States and the Soviet Union, and with neither side gaining a decisive advantage, both nations agreed to halt hostilities. On September 23, 1965, a formal ceasefire came into effect under the auspices of the United Nations. Despite sporadic violations, the ceasefire largely held, and active combat operations were brought to a standstill. However, tensions and mistrust between the two sides remained high, and a final political resolution was still needed to formalize peace and withdrawal. In the months that followed, the Soviet Union offered to mediate direct talks between India and Pakistan. The result was the Tashkent Conference, held in January 1966 in Tashkent, which was then part of the Soviet Union. Indian Prime Minister Lal Bahadur Shastri and Pakistani President Ayub Khan met face-to-face for the first time since the war. The Soviet Premier, Alexei Kosygin, played a central role in facilitating the dialogue. After several days of negotiations, both leaders signed the Tashkent Agreement on January 10, 1966. The agreement required both sides to withdraw to pre-war positions, release prisoners of war, and restore diplomatic relations. It also called for non-interference in each other's internal affairs and peaceful resolution of future disputes through bilateral discussions. Although the agreement ended the immediate conflict, it did not address the core issue of Kashmir, leaving the root cause of the war unresolved, while the ceasefire and the Tashkent Agreement succeeded in ending active warfare. They did little to remove the underlying political and territorial tensions that had led to the war in the first place. The 1965 war left a lasting impact on both India and Pakistan, not just militarily but also politically and emotionally. Although the war ended without any major territorial changes, it deepened the distrust and hostility between the two nations. Both countries claimed victory in their own narratives, but international observers generally viewed the outcome as a stalemate. The war exposed weaknesses in planning and coordination on both sides, leading to significant reassessments within their respective armed forces. In India, the conflict boosted national morale and solidified the country's commitment to strengthening its military infrastructure. The Indian public saw the war as a demonstration of resilience, especially after the earlier setback in the 1962 war with China. In Pakistan. While initial propaganda portrayed military success, the eventual outcome led to growing dissatisfaction among the population and political elite. The failure of Operation Gibraltar and the inability to achieve strategic goals caused internal criticism of military leadership and President Ayub Khan's government. This war also sowed the seeds of political unrest in Pakistan, which would intensify in the following years and contribute to significant changes in its political structure. Internationally, the war drew attention to the volatility of the South Asian region and the risks of unresolved territorial disputes. The role of external powers, especially the US and the Soviet Union, highlighted the global concern over potential escalation between two newly independent nations. Another major consequence was the arms race that followed. Both India and Pakistan began investing heavily in defense capabilities, which included advancements in air power, armor, and eventually nuclear technology. The war shaped the strategic thinking of both nations for decades. Despite the ceasefire and peace talks, the Kashmir issue remained unresolved, guaranteeing that the animosity created by the 1965 war would continue to influence their relationship. In the years ahead, here is a conclusion for the entire speech on the history of the India and Pakistan War of 1965. Written in the same warm, reflective tone, war often begins with plans, borders, and power, but it always ends with loss, pain, and lessons. The India-Pakistan War of 1965 showed us how history, misunderstandings, and pride can ignite something. No one truly wins. Though the battles were fierce and bravery was shown on both sides, what remained afterward were broken families, deep scars, and questions that still echo today. The ceasefire brought silence to the guns, but not to the hearts of those who lived through it. This story is not just about politics or army sits, about people, about the cost of conflict, and the hope that someday, even the deepest divides can be bridged with understanding, compassion, and peace. When we remember this chapter of history, may we not only honor the courage shown, but also commit ourselves to the harder task of choosing peace over pride and dialogue over division.